So as you probably know by now, in this series of Sangha nights, we're looking at the path of the Bodhisattva, the path of the Buddhist who is practicing not just to enjoy liberation from negative mental states themselves, but also for the welfare of others, for the welfare of the world. We heard last week that the Buddha frequently exhorted his followers to practice, in his words, for the welfare of the many, for the well-being of human and superhuman beings. But this attitude to Buddhist practice might have got a bit lost sight of in certain quarters in the 500 years or so after the Buddha's death, his parinibbana. So that Buddhism came to be seen in some quarters as a quest for personal liberation, individual liberation, and the more altruistic side was ignored. So in response to that degeneration, a new movement arose within Buddhism, calling itself the Mahayana, the great vehicle or the great way. And one important aspect, probably the most important aspect of the Mahayana, the great way, was that it sought to get back to that attitude taught by the Buddha that we should practice for the welfare of all, for the welfare of the world. That was the ideal motivation for practice, because it allowed us to rise above our constant tendency to always focus on our own well-being. And if we're focusing on our own well-being as our motivation to go beyond the self, there's something rather contrary in there. There's something rather contrary about focusing on ourselves in order to go beyond ourselves. We need something bigger than ourselves as our motivation. Because the Dharma is about helping us to break out of the prison of a small, isolated, cramped self. So in the Mahayana, in this new movement that arose within Buddhism, a Buddhist who practiced with that motivation, with the welfare of for the welfare of the many, rather than just for individual liberation, was called a Bodhisattva. Bodhi meaning wisdom, sattva meaning being. So the Bodhisattva path that arose wasn't a new path or a different path. It was a restatement of the Buddha's original path with a renewed emphasis on altruism. And maybe also taking into account some of the changes in human society and the conditions that have come about in the 500 years since the Buddha's death. And the most important and the most accessible formulations of the Bodhisattva path were called the 10 and the 6 and the 10 paramitas. We had a flip chart. On the flip chart it says paramitas. Paramita meaning often translated as perfection, also translatable as way beyond, the way beyond. So 10 or 6 ways beyond our small, cramped, present self to something more transcendental, something bigger, more universal. And in this series of Sangha nights, we're exploring the list of 10 paramitas, 10 practices that take us beyond our limited selfhood. And we got as far as meditation. So we've looked at, and here we test my dharmic memory, we've looked at ethics. No, we haven't. We looked at generosity as the first one. We looked at ethics as the second one. We looked at what's called shanti, patient forbearance, the ability to just not get blown around by events and conditions as the third one. We looked at energy and effort as the fourth. And we've looked at meditation, which is the fifth. Last week, I talked about insight, about what is often said to be the main aim of meditation, insight into the nature of reality. And that was our last talk on meditation. And I said then that, well, we call it insight, but insight is perhaps not a very good word for insight. It's not a very good word for the sort of direct experience of the nature of reality that we're talking about, which is the aim of meditation. Anyway, having looked at that topic of insight last week, tonight we're moving on to the next parameter, the next way beyond, which insight leads to, which is wisdom, Klanyar wisdom. Okay, so what do we mean in Buddhism when we talk about wisdom? And the first thing to say is that wisdom is not about knowing a lot. Okay, so it doesn't mean having a PhD in Buddhist philosophy. That's not what wisdom amounts to. It's not even about being clever. It's not about being intellectually able. So yeah, wisdom is not, it certainly does not mean being cold and sceptical and one-sidedly rational. It doesn't mean that at all. So wisdom is not about the sort of ability that is generally valued by Western scholars, or the mindset that's generally valued by Western scholars. Someone could be a very gifted scholar and still be singularly lacking in wisdom. Whereas somebody could be very wise with virtually no formal education and not being particularly good at manipulating concepts in the way that we think of as sort of academic intelligence. Indeed, it might help to have no formal education. That might help us to be wise. Because having no formal education means that the person won't have been conditioned to see things through the lens of whatever ideas and ideologies happen to be fashionable at the time among educated people. So that's one thing that wisdom ain't. And secondly, wisdom is not just cognitive. It's not just about knowing. It's not just intellectual. It's connected to emotion and it's connected to intuitive faith. So wisdom includes our intuitive response to truth, to beauty, to higher values. It's partly, a part of it is a heart response to higher values, not a cold, sort of supposedly objective, cold rationalism. Our intuitive faith, what's called Shraddha in Buddhism, can be a sort of forerunner of wisdom. It's got a lot in common with wisdom. And also wisdom is not divorced, on the same subject, wisdom is not divorced from emotion. So, okay, wisdom is about cognition, if you like. It is about the way we see things. It's about the way we see the world. But we can't separate cognition from emotion and volition. These are three aspects of our state of being. And although we talk about them as though they were separate, in actual fact, they can never be separated. The way we feel, the way we see things, and the motivation that drive us are three aspects of the same thing. They're three aspects of our overall state of being. And we all know that. We all know that, really. We glibly talk about our feelings as though we're separate from the way we see things, but we all know that. When we're in a bad mood, when we're angry or irritated or depressed, we see the world through the lens of that mental state. We all know that. The same person can seem like wonderful one day and then really annoying another day. Sheffield can look really beautiful one day and then like a dump the next day. According to how we feel. According to how we feel. And according to how we feel also, we'll behave differently. We'll behave quite differently. So yeah, if we're in a bad mood, angry or depressed or irritated, we see the world in a particular way, we act in a particular way that's in accord with our mental states. When we're filled with metta, we see the world in a completely different way. We see other people in a completely different way. So cognition, emotion, volition, they're three aspects of our total state of being. The way we see things, the way we feel, and the way we feel moved to act, they're three aspects of our total state. You can't do one and, you can't sort of separate them out. They're three aspects of our total state. So, okay, wisdom is about seeing things more as they are, seeing reality more clearly, but not because we're clever and we figured it out, but because we're seeing it from a clearer, better mental state. We're seeing it from a higher plane of being. We're seeing it from a, yes, our overall state of being is lifted to a higher level. Because the way we see things is a reflection of our state of being. I've already said that. It's a product of our total state. A dog sees things in this very limited doggy fashion. Okay? When we're children, we saw things as a child sees them. We saw things from a childish perspective, in which a lot of things were crushingly important that we now see had no importance whatsoever. We maybe feared things that weren't there. We got really upset about small things to do with play or our toys, whether that person's nicked my whatever. All sorts of things to do with play and toys got us really upset. If a treat was postponed or cancelled, it was a catastrophe, and we'd be in tears about it. Then we grew up. And in some ways, we expanded our perspective. And the way we saw things changed accordingly. So, we had a wider view, we understood more, we saw that wasn't a catastrophe. And, if in case we're doing it on Sunday rather than Saturday, it doesn't matter. So things that once would have had us in tears, no longer remotely important. And in Buddhism, it's assumed that that normal adult way of seeing things that we've grown into isn't the end of the story. We can keep on growing up. We can keep on growing so that we see life, the way we see life in the world keeps getting clearer, keeps getting closer to reality. Our perspective continues to expand. And this culminates in enlightenment, if in fact there is any such endpoint at all. And I have a very, very strong suspicion that to an enlightened being, a lot of the kerfuffle we make about life is just like, they would see it just like the way we see children and the fuss they make about things that don't matter. All the sort of, we get so upset about things, which I suspect from an enlightened point of view, it's like, yeah, never mind, dear. So that's what I'm talking about when I say wisdom, not cleverness or knowledge, but seeing things as they are, seeing things as they appear from a higher mental state, a wider perspective, seeing things as they look from a higher plane of being, as a being who has grown further. And in such a higher state, not only do we see things clearly, but our emotional responses are in accord with that state, and our volition, the energy that drives our actions, will be in accord with that state. There are three aspects of that total state of being, higher state of being. Our higher state of being will have those three aspects, which we call wisdom, on the one hand, and then we call it, the emotional aspect, we call all sorts of things like metta and compassion and empathy, secondly, and then we call it energy, the energy for the good that comes from those volitions. So those three aspects, at least three aspects of enlightenment, wisdom, metta and compassion and energy. And of those, maybe wisdom is the most, they're all parts of enlightenment, they're all aspects of enlightenment. Maybe wisdom is the most difficult one to, difficult to imagine, because we all have metta. We've all experienced metta, we've all experienced compassion. We've all experienced times when we're really fired up with energy. And we can sort of raise those to a higher level and imagine what it might be like to have those much, much more fully. But wisdom somehow seems much more subtle and elusive, I think. What would it feel like? What would it be like to have wisdom? So tonight, I'm going to try to introduce this topic of wisdom by looking at an archetypal embodiment of wisdom. Because in that way, maybe circumventing language a little bit, we can get a feel for what wisdom could be like. We can get a taste of what wisdom might be like. We can get an echo of the experience of wisdom, maybe, by looking at an archetypal embodiment. So in Buddhism there are two main every Buddhist archetypal figure in a way is an embodiment of wisdom, but there are two main archetypal figures who embody wisdom. And one is a female figure and one is a male figure. And tonight I'm going to talk about the male figure, Manjughosha or Manjusri. I feel we have a picture here. So Manjusri he's not a historical figure. He's not a flesh and blood person. And he never has been a flesh and blood person. He is what we call, trying to make it acceptable to our rational Western minds, he's what we call an archetypal figure, whatever that means. He exists in a different realm from the material. A realm that we can contact in our imagination, in meditation, in visionary experience. But he's nonetheless real or powerful for that. We could say that Manjughosha is the form that reality takes when it seeks to represent itself to our minds. The form that wisdom takes when it seeks to represent itself to our minds, if we forge some sort of connection with him. So he is wisdom, and he brings wisdom to others. He is the way enlightened wisdom presents itself to our minds. So, okay, the name Manjusri, M-A-N, I haven't got a flip chart, M-A-N-J-U-S-R-I, Manjusri, means gentle lord, or gentle glory, or gentle glorious one. His other name, Manjughosha, which means gentle voice. He of the gentle voice. So wisdom speaks with a soft voice, a gentle voice, a small, quiet voice. To hear the voice of wisdom, we need to quieten down all the clatter that goes on in our minds, the chattering, or the rubbish that goes on in our minds. To let that calm down, to hear the voice of wisdom. That probably means we need to take ourselves away from all the input and distractions that the world throws at us for periods in our life. We need to calm and quiet our minds. We are likely to hear the gentle voice of wisdom, the gentle voice of Manjughosha best in meditation, or when we are quiet, poised, alert, calm, focused, and one-pointed. And that is the connection between meditation and wisdom. That's when we're likely to hear that quiet voice. So the voice of wisdom, the voice of Manjughosha, is quiet, but it's also very beautiful. So Manjughosha has a very beautiful voice, musical, attractive. He is called the Lord of Speech. That's one of his names, the Lord of Speech. He is said to speak softly to anyone capable of listening, speaking to each beautifully, attractively, in their own language, saying precisely what they need to hear. So I'll read you a bit of a poem, actually. I'll read you a bit of a poem in praise of Manjughosha, Cloud of Praises of Manjughosha by Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa was a medieval Buddhist teacher in Tibet. He founded the tradition which the Dalai Lama is part of. And clearly he was a devotee of Manjughosha. Manjughosha, Lord of Speech. Your voice is in all worlds, in every language, teaching what's needed in the minds of beings. Your speech, like music from outside samsara, takes away the suffering of every ear it enters. Pleasant and gentle, charming, heart-stirring, harmonious, pure and sweet like clear light, smooth, soft, calming. It pleases the ear, it satisfies the body, it soothes the heart, it brings delight. Revealing the truth about all things, easy to understand, bright, delightful, enlightening, reasonable, relevant, concise, its rhythm just right, not too loud when near, not too faint when far. In eloquent phrases, encouraging, full of joy and insight, coherent, conclusive, respectful, direct. Its 64-fold harmonies are present in every word you speak, speaking to countless disciples, each in their own language. As far as space can reach, your voice gives happiness to lucky beings, dispelling delusions, like a voice from the sky, like the deep thunder from a rain cloud, walking on its legs of lightning. So that's Tsongkhapa's praises of, it's much part of a much longer poem, but it's his praises of Manjughosha's voice, if you like, the voice of the Buddha, the voice of wisdom, the voice of Dharma. And yeah, so Manjughosha is Lord of speech. And it's said that he gives his devotees eloquence, clarity in their communication, and persuasiveness. And he's particularly associated with communicating the Dharma. So that's something about Manjughosha's speech. What about his appearance? Okay, we have an image of Manjughosha by Chintamani. Images never work, incidentally. I mean, these are something that occur in our mind, and images always rubbish, really. Not like it, but it'll do. It'll have to do. So, in our minds, Manjughosha emerges from a beautiful, clear blue sky. And he sits on a blue lotus. But this blue lotus is hardly any different from the sky. You can hardly tell it. It's almost subtly emerges from the blue of the sky. It's just subtly different. It manifests from the spaciousness and freedom of the blue sky and of space, of the void. And Manjughosha also manifests in that way. And he's shown as a handsome, well-built young man. His upper body naked, otherwise royally dressed in silk robes, in the very prime of youth. And he's golden in colour. In fact, he's made of golden light. He shines from within. He's not like, he shines from within. He's made of light, not hard, heavy stuff like you and I. And he's not like sort of a neon thing. He's made of light, but he shimmers. He wavers like a reflection of light on water in our mind's eye. He's said to be like a tent, a beautiful tent which is slightly billowing in a breeze, or a reflection shimmering on water. Sometimes his colour is described as being like sunlight reflected in a lion's eye. If you got close enough to look at sunlight reflect, but which will be a quite scary experience, and maybe this brings across something about Manjughosha that he's a bit threatening, really. It's a bit threatening to our fixed self, a bit threatening to the way we see ourselves. But yeah, if you got close enough to see sunlight reflected in a lion's eye, that would be his colour. I've never done it myself, but sunlight will do for me. Sunlight on water. An image like sunlight on water. So his colour is sometimes described as being like the sun, but perhaps more orange. But how you see these things is, you can't control it. It comes from somewhere deeper. So he's the gold of the sun. He's gold of sunlight in a lion's eye. He's made of golden light. And he's shown as sitting in full lotus position, which gives him a sense of stability, of calm, of being above ordinary events. On the one hand, but there's also a great sense of movement about him. So he's completely stable, but at the same time it's as though he's always moving. And this is brought across, I think, by the streamers that gracefully sort of billow in the wind of whatever dimension Manjughosha occupies. So, as you see in in the image there, in Chintamani's image, he's usually shown holding the sword of wisdom above his head in this beautiful, poised, graceful way. Not as though he's going to chop wood with it. It's a beautiful, poised, graceful way. And just to show that it's no ordinary sword, it's running with flames. There's flames running along the edges of his sword. And this sword of wisdom, is said to be so sharp that if you let a piece of silk fall, it would just be parted by the sword without deviating one bit. It would just sort of fall in two like that. So the sword is that sharp. It would be as though the sword wasn't even there. So Manjushri Manjughosha is also normally shown holding a book to his heart with his left hand, showing that he's really taken the contents of the book to heart. It's become part of him. And of course, this is no ordinary book. This is the book. This is the book of wisdom. This is the book. God, it would be really good to find it in the library. This is the book. If we got it out and read it, it would totally change our perspective on the world. We would never see things in the same way, and all our problems would be over. Yippee. We used to produce this, we had this several years running, we had this wonderful Dharma Day poster of these girls looking at the book and golden light shining out of this book and illuminating their faces. And I think that's the sort of book this would be. This is the book. The book. It's the book of wisdom. And he holds it to his heart. It's part of him. It's not... he doesn't just know it intellectually. It's part of him. It fuels the way he lives. It shows, in a way, that the knowledge we're talking about is heart knowledge as much as it is head knowledge. He's not holding it to his head. He's holding it to his heart. He's living from it. His face is friendly and joyful. He's always delighted to see you. He's friendly and joyful. He wears lotuses above his ears. I rather like that touch. I mean, you've got to like someone who wears lotuses behind their ears. And a royal crown of jewels. He's got two auras, as is usual. And the aura I particularly like is his whole body aura. Figures like this are said to have two auras. One composed of their merit, the whole body aura, and one of their wisdom. So his wisdom aura is a sort of pale turquoise sort of colour. His whole body aura is blue, like the sun, like the sky. It's sky blue, much like the sky that he's sitting in front of. But it's run through with moving, gently waving threads of light. Like the light you would see if you paddle in a beach on a sunny day in a clear water, you see light running across the sand. That's what's going on in his aura all the time. It's just this running sort of beautiful networks of light and threads of light. And the overall impression he gives is one of, as I say, poise and ease combined with energy and playfulness. There's this tremendous calm energy about his posture, as though he was always cutting with his sword, always moving while never moving. And this is heightened by the fact that his robes and streamers are always in this process of swirling in the breeze of the higher dimension that he inhabits. And, okay, maybe that image of Manjughosha can tell us a little bit more about wisdom than what wisdom really is, than maybe a book on philosophy. There's a few things about that image that I'd really like to pick out. The first is, he combines two opposites. I mean, we always talk about Buddha images, or Enlightenment images combining opposites. He combines the opposites of a great stability of the full lotus position. That, if you've sat in full lotus, it just feels like I did once and my knees stood. you know it just feels completely stable, completely stable. And it combines that with a great deal of movement and energy. So it's as though it's always sitting totally stable, but also always dancing. The lotus position gives him that sense of stability, of calm, of being above ordinary events. And that's an important aspect of wisdom, being above ordinary events, not being blown around by events. One fruit of wisdom is that it allows us to have this higher perspective. Once again, I'll use the analogy of the child who is blown away by all sorts of things that we can see don't matter. We are blown around by all sorts of things that don't matter. And rising above that to a higher perspective is one important fruit of wisdom. Wisdom allows us to be a bit above events. It makes us more immune to being blown around by what happens to us. We see the big picture, so we don't sweat the small stuff. So, that's a bumper sticker, I think. Don't sweat the small stuff. And I think there's an accompanying one which says it's all small stuff, or most of it. So yes, it frees us up from being constantly blown around by events. And maybe that's, and that gives us that sense of joy. And maybe that's communicated by the sort of stability combined with the sense of movement. A second thing, a really important thing about Manjugosha is he's young, he's in the prime of life, but he's also ancient. He's been in the prime of life for thousands of years, at least. He is eternally youthful, eternally fresh, eternally creative, because he's eternally freed from the mind-made limitations that would make him old. And this is connected with his sword of wisdom. The sword is always, as it were, cutting what binds us. In the practice of Manjugosha, it talks about cutting the iron fetters of karma. It cuts the way the past has made us. It cuts off the old, outdated versions of ourselves that we get stuck in. We get identified with the past. We get identified with the person we've been in the past. And that's like a box that stops us from being eternally youthful. We get stuck in habits. If we're not careful, our whole life becomes this habit. And it cuts away at that. Cuts away at all the things we identify with that keep us stuck in a box. Cuts away our ideologies, our views. We tend to have pretty fixed views about the nature of the world, all sorts of ideologies that we've been conditioned to accept. And when we live in those ideas about the world, that makes our lives boring and predictable and grey. Because we're not living in the real world, we're living in ideas about the real world, diagrams of the real world, descriptions of the real world. So Manjugosha's sword cuts through the ideas we have about ourselves based on the past, cuts through our views and ideologies, seeing that none of them can be absolute truth. And this frees us up to live in a constantly changing, magical, beautiful, miraculous universe of endless possibility, which is the way the world really is. The world's a miracle. If we stand back, forget all the things we think we know about the world and just go, well, what's going on? It's like baffling. It is like just totally mind-boggling. And are we mind-boggled? No. We think we've got it all sussed. We think, we just go through it. It's just boring old life, just go through it. Anyway, that's just me going on. So Manjusri, in his graceful dancing posture, always effortlessly cutting off deluded views, effortlessly cutting off limiting false stories we tell about ourselves and the world, effortlessly cutting off the views we hold because of our limited point of view and our limited conditioning, cutting off all the things that keep us stuck in old versions of ourselves that make us old. So he's eternally youthful, eternally dancing into the future. And that gives him this overall impression of poise and ease and joy, of being beyond care. He's joyful and completely free from anxiety, free to respond with friendliness and compassion, free to course in an appreciative way of being that is almost playful, free to enjoy the beauty of what is, freed from all the fixed views and the stories we tell that limit us and make the world a grey place. So youth, playfulness, sword of wisdom, they're all connected. They're very, very much connected. And I mean, the tradition tells us that to have wisdom is to go beyond worries. That's what the Dharma tells us. To go beyond worries and problems and anxieties, because our problems and our worries and our anxieties are based on our limited, self-obsessed perspective and the stories we tell about the world, and our life based on a deluded viewpoint. So the tradition tells us that to see clearly is to go beyond fear, to be joyful, to be playful, to see that things are all right, to completely go beyond the sense that life is some sort of problem. And that frees us up to live in a much more colourful way, full colour way, I should say, whereas our nagging sense of anxiety drags us down. So those are a few of the things I'd like to bring out about the image of Manjushri. What might this say to us? How might what this image communicates tell us about how we should maybe live, to live more wisely or practice? So the first thing I think that we can deduce from this is we would live much more wisely and have much more of the joy and playfulness of Manjushri if we just sat lighter to events. Okay? Take our hopes and fears less seriously. We've probably all had the experience of thinking of something happening that we thought was a disaster and that turned out to be very positive. So our relationship breaks up or we lose our job. And it's a disaster, it's the end of the world. And later we find it has liberated us from an old stale pattern or an old stale life that had got us stuck. So bad things happen and they turn out to be good. Good things happen and they turn out to be bad. I know at least 2 people have inherited a load of money. And, it's wonderful, celebrations, yeah. And in fact, a few years down the line, they've been desperately unhappy, largely because of the money. In a terrible mess, because the effect of the money has had on them. So we just don't know. We just don't know. There's a story I quite like about a Chinese farmer. Maybe too many people have heard this. Too many people have heard this, I won't say.
It's a good story.
It's a good story, all right. So this Chinese farmer, maybe he's Chinese, I don't know, he might be Serbo-Croat for one. Anyway, he has a horse that he uses for ploughing his land. And one day his horse runs away. And all the villagers say, "Oh, isn't it terrible? You've lost your horse. Are you going to plough your land? You're going to go broke." And he goes, "We'll see." And then a week later, his horse comes back and brings a whole herd of horses that it's befriended. And the villagers all go, "Oh, isn't it great? You've got 12 horses now. Isn't that wonderful? You've got 12 horses." And he says, "We'll see." And then his son is trying to tame one of the stallions that came back with this herd of horses and gets thrown and breaks his leg. And the villagers will go, "Oh, isn't it terrible? Isn't it terrible? Your son's broken his leg. The stallion's broken your son's leg." And he says, "We'll see." And then the local warlord declares war on the neighbouring kingdom and rounds up all the young men to go and fight. And his son doesn't have to go because he's got a broken leg. And all the villagers go, "Oh, isn't it wonderful? Your son didn't have to go off and fight." And he says, "We'll see, we'll see." And life's like that, isn't it? I mean, things happen. And we make a big melodrama out of it when we just don't know. We just don't know whether things are going to work out well or whether they're not. And even when events are clearly adverse, even when things are clearly adverse, wisdom tells us to sit light, to not getting what we want and to getting what we don't want. So the Buddha talked about this. He said, well, what it's like is somebody who's shot by an arrow, and then they stab themselves with a second arrow. And their second arrow is the mental suffering they get from their mental response to something. So, I don't know, you get a cold. There's a certain amount of suffering in getting a cold. And then it's, I've got a cold, isn't it terrible, etc., etc. We cause ourselves far more hassle far more suffering, actually, by our mental suffering over our life than we do by the physical things that we happen to us. So it's just not wise to stab ourselves with second arrows of mental suffering. Why not just take it? Just take it as it is and stay in a positive mental state. So that would be my first thing about what can we get from Manji Geshe about wisdom. We would just sit light to events. Connected to that would be to sit light to likes and dislikes. So we all have these likes and dislikes, don't we? So I really like that, I hate that. And when we get the things we like, we think that's wonderful. And when we get the things we don't like, we sometimes get irritated or angry or sad. But a lot of these likes and dislikes are completely arbitrary. Completely arbitrary. I like porridge, you like muesli. You hate porridge, etc., etc. There's a wonderful talk by an order member called Ratna Prabha in which he talks about this, and he says all likes and dislikes are completely arbitrary, apart from not liking barley cup, because that is completely, absolutely horrible. So yeah, sit light to likes and dislikes. Don't let it irritate us when we don't get what we want. See beyond them a bit. If we tell a story about how our likes and dislikes are really important and how we've got to constantly get what we like and avoid what we don't like, then life is going to be a problem. Sit light to likes and dislikes. Sit light to ideologies, views, and opinions. We very often have really fixed ideas. We define ourselves by views, opinions, ideas. And usually we haven't thought about them. I mean, how much time have you actually spent thinking about your opinions? How much do we actually know? Usually there are people who know much more than us who think the opposite. What we do is we pick them up as part of our sort of self-view from our family, our culture, our peer group, the group in society that we think we're a part of, what's fashionable at the moment, what we should think. We think what we should think. And then we end up living in all these ideas. So sitting lightly to our views, our opinions, being willing to think that we don't know. We don't actually know. The Dharma tells us we're all deluded. So part of that delusion is that an awful lot of what we think is deluded. It's upside down. And if we can actually take that on board, then actually it's quite liberating. There's a story. It's not a story. There's a quote about a Zen monk who said, "Who would have thought after practicing for 20 years I would end up completely stupid?" But actually, to know that we're stupid is the first stop in not being stupid. To be really stupid is to think we're not, actually, to think we're not. So sit a bit freer. Sit freer to views. Sit freer to views, likes and dislikes, ideologies and views, even our mental states, our thoughts and our feelings, we take them very seriously, don't we? Oh, I think that. I feel this, or I feel this. Mental weather, conditioned mental weather, comes and goes. Tomorrow we feel differently. Nothing absolute about them. To be able to stand back from the stuff that happens in our minds, our mental weather, and not identify it with it, not make it me, that's really liberating. That's an aspect of wisdom. Yeah, so standing back from, I missed here somewhere. Standing back from the contents of our minds, if you like, and standing back from ideas of who we are. So we're often defined by the past. We define ourselves by our past. Because I've been like that, I must be that sort of person. This is who I am. And in that way we limit ourselves. We tell all sorts of stories about ourselves. And letting go of that, actually. Let's live more because of the person we could be. That would also be an aspect of using this Manjughosha's sword to cut away all the things that bind us. So those are a few of my suggestions about how we can actually implement a bit of wisdom, a bit of Manjughosha's wisdom in our life, and actually have a bit more of that playful, joyful energy in our life, a bit less stuck. So, yeah, how about that? So, that would be nice.